Mercy is the theme that links our scriptures today. Jesus said, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." He was echoing the prophet Hosea, "I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice," meaning the quality of our relationships with others and with God is more important than any ritual. Mercy is God's compassion for all people. Mercy is all those times that God weeps at the pain that we cause for each other. Mercy is also all those times God chooses to forgive out of compassion for our weakness and our confusion. God's mercy is central to our faith. God is moved by human need, and God responds with mercy. That's who God is. It would be wonderful if all of God's followers would emphasize mercy and compassion as they practice their faith. But it seems like mercy has been one of the hardest things for human beings to learn. In Jesus' day, it was the Pharisees who made an art out of limiting God's mercy. They were obsessed with following religious laws. This is how they thought they could honor God best. They took pains to keep themselves ritually pure, morally, spiritually, and physically pure. They maintained sharp boundaries between pure and impure, righteous and sinner, whole and not whole. Their boundaries pervaded the society. Our culture today has its own rules about what makes a person clean or unclean. These rules have to do with the color of a person's skin, the language they speak, their sexual orientation or their gender identity, where they live, how much money they make. These rules aren't written down anywhere, but you know they might as well be. We're not as far ahead of the Pharisees as we might think. Jesus came to teach all of us a completely new way, centered in God's mercy. When we look at who Jesus was, we are most struck by how Jesus treated the people around him. Instead of shunning or separating himself, Jesus shared meals with sinners, touched untouchables. He accepted people who were outcast by others. He made broken people whole. He welcomed little children when other people wanted to send them away. For Jesus, honoring God wasn't about staying pure. Honoring God was about living compassionately. Today's gospel tells story after story of Christ showing mercy. There was a tax collector named Matthew, whose name is borne by the gospel we are reading this year, that Matthew. Matthew, who sat in his booth counting the day's receipts. Like other tax collectors, he made his salary by overcharging the taxpayers and pocketing the surplus. So by definition, Matthew was a crook. All tax collectors were. That's why righteous folks snubbed him, and pretty much everybody hated him. But there was one person who seemed to see beneath Matthew's crusty exterior and see the lonely soul inside. One man saw his potential. I doubt that we can fully understand how radical, how merciful it was for Jesus to call Matthew to be a disciple. There was a woman in the crowd there. She was filled with shame and despair. Her body was betraying her. She'd been bleeding for 12 long years. And this was more than a personal health struggle. Religious purity laws at that time condemned the natural cycles of women's bodies. They labeled her unclean. They barred her from all kinds of normal activities. But this woman reached out boldly to touch Jesus' clothes in faith that she might be made well. And Jesus turned, he fixed his gaze on her, he graced her with the full power of his compassionate, healing attention, and he greeted her, not just as a second-class person, but as a daughter of God. He called her daughter. I doubt we can fully understand how radical it was, how merciful it was for Jesus to be touched by this woman and to heal her. And even more so, the way Jesus went to the home of the synagogue leader. Now, that was an important man. Surely he was a man who was seen as being holy and pure. But at his house, Jesus did the unthinkable. He touched the dead body of this man's little daughter to raise her to life. That is something the priests of Israel would never have done, touching a corpse. It was the highest defilement. But Jesus touched the little girl. He opened her eyes. For the sake of mercy, those religious rules had to be broken. For the sake of new life, for the sake of love. Time and again in his ministry, Jesus went out of his way to deliberately, intentionally, publicly defy those oppressive social and religious norms. And it was because he heard God saying, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Compassion, not empty rituals. Love, not judgment. Jesus reaches out to all of us with God's mercy, God's loving kindness. We have known what it is to be ashamed of ourselves, to feel that somehow we are unclean and unworthy. We know what it's like to be sick of ourselves sometimes, sick of our ways, to wish for a new start and a new chance at life. There are times when we've been lonely for God's love, lonely for the unconditional acceptance that only God can give. Many times, we've needed some kind of proof that we're worthy of God's consideration, proof that God accepts us and forgives us and loves us as we are, proof that God's mercy is for us too, not just somebody else who needs it more. Jesus reaches out to all of us with God's mercy. And in Christ's forgiving love, we are found again. We're brought home. We're given a fresh start. In fact, because of this, we live in a constant state of thanksgiving, a constant state of praise for our merciful and loving God who accepts us and forgives us and gives us that gift of new life again and again and again without end. Mercy. Mercy is at the very heart of Jesus' ministry. And for people who follow Jesus, mercy is meant to be at the heart of who we are as well. How do we practice Christ's mercy, personally and as a society? How do God's compassion and God's loving kindness shape our dealings with other people? I think we have a hunch about what examples not to follow. Today, there are plenty of people who call themselves Christian, who seem to be working awfully hard to establish their own modern-day purity code, to enforce not just for churchgoers, but to enact into law for the general public. Their purity code excludes people who have needed abortions. It condemns people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer in any expression. Their purity code is about banning books and denying medical treatment. It wants to prohibit textbooks that teach about evolution, or dare to reckon with the institutional racism that continues to scar our siblings and warp our nation. It's difficult to see where mercy or compassion plays into this worldview. But it's easy to see how readily people who are entrenched in an old order can oppose justice and deny other people their rights, all the while calling it holiness, calling it God's will. I really wonder how compassionate love can find bold expression in our civic life, in the life we share together in this nation. How mercy can boldly challenge judgmentalism. How people who love Jesus can call out these movements that claim to be Christian, but actually betray God's mercy in so many ways. True mercy is about being moved by the needs of others and responding. True mercy is about showing compassion and loving kindness in our everyday lives. True mercy is, well, you know it when you see it. One person who's taught me about mercy is a guy named Ryan Dowd. Ryan Dowd ran a homeless shelter in Chicago, and he puts out an email newsletter for people who do the same. And he writes about situations that others don't seem to discuss. Things like, what's the best way to de-escalate somebody who's riled up? He does this with a spirit of humor and kindness and good common sense. One thing Ryan Dowd emphasizes over and over is treating every single person with respect. Treating each person with positive regard, no matter who they are. Treating people as valuable human beings, no matter their station in life. One morning, a guy named Michael came running up to Ryan in the parking area of the shelter. Michael was a big guy who'd been homeless for decades, and this morning his clothes were covered with mud and leaves. There were leaves in his hair. He was angry. He was riled up. He was yelling loud. And it would have been really easy for Ryan to react with alarm. But instead, here's what Ryan did. He turned to face this big guy, Michael. He made eye contact. He smiled. He put his hand out to shake his hand. And he said, "Good morning, Michael," in his most welcoming voice. Michael stopped 5 feet away with a look of slight confusion. Good morning, Michael said in a quieter voice. He shook Ryan's hand. They started a conversation that actually went somewhere. I'm really not suggesting that we can all do something like this, but it's genius, isn't it? Greeting Michael with respect went such a long way. It told him that he mattered. It diffused his anger. It helped him calm himself. It made it possible for these two men to connect. Ryan Dowd's behavior told Michael he was somebody, not a problem, but a person. It expressed compassion. Really, it expressed mercy. Ryan Dowd says that his mentor was a nun, Sister Rosemarie. And this was her philosophy. It was based on one truth. All people are basically good. Each person is of intrinsic value and worth, just because they're human. Ryan's question for us is this: do you believe that? Do you believe that every person is of incalculable value? He says, do you really, really believe it? Do you believe that each homeless person and every drug addict and all convicted criminals and Donald Trump and Joe Biden and Brad Pitt and Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky and Paris Hilton are all of inherent value and worth? And Ryan issues a challenge. He says, try it. For the next few hours, every time you see someone, think to yourself, that person is of inherent value. He says, make sure you do it when you see somebody you don't like. This is where the exercise can really change your heart. Well, I don't know what Ryan Dowd's faith beliefs or religious practices might be, if any. But it's clear to me that he understands mercy. He applies it in his life, and he calls others to do the same. I hope you and I can come to understand mercy too, so that wherever we are, whoever we're with, whatever issues we are considering, our first lens will be compassion and respect for other human beings in the spirit of Christ's love. Jesus said, "Go and learn what this means. Mercy comes first." Every day is our opportunity to learn mercy and walk in Christ's way.